Graduated in 2003, so just over a decade ago. And I think Mike here, who's much more professional and technologically inclined, has done a little PowerPoint presentation. It's more just photos, apparently. I'll let them come up slowly. Mike and I are going to go back and forth. This is the early days. So just before I get into the thing there, on the left, that's Mike and his dad, Jack Layton, at City Hall in the early days. My father was also a city councillor. This is when I actually won life's most embarrassing moments as a child, because my dad was being interviewed and I was eating the microphone on live television. Anyway, Mike has some photos that'll pop up along the way. Listen, what we're going to do today, we're just going to go back and forth a little bit. And we're going to do it in 3 sections. We're going to start, each of us, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got socially engaged on political issues. Then we're going to talk a little bit about, in our different ways, how our values were grounded for me in Africa, for Mike in environmental issues. And then we're going to talk about politics. Mike's a city councillor. I managed his campaign. I managed his stepmom, Olivia Chow's campaign, and others. And we're going to talk about why you could, should, must need to get involved in politics. Something changed for me while I was at NT. And I'm going to take you back, you were all alive, to the fall of 2002. So the fall of 2002, George W. Bush was the president. And the war drums were beating about the war in Iraq. Were they or were they not going to go to war in Iraq? And so I was in grade 13 here at school, and in November of 2002 I went up to a demonstration against the war. I was just part of it as a student, and I got involved. That's a shot from 2004 in Washington. It's a peace flag, you just can't see it. So in 2002, in the fall, I went to a demonstration. I picked up the Toronto Star one morning, I remember it well, it was a Saturday, and they said there was going to be a march to oppose Canada's involvement in a war that they thought was coming. So I went in and marched, and I met some other students there. And there was a youth organization, Students Against Sanctions and War in Iraq, that I joined. And I started getting more and more involved. On February the 15th of 2003, there were 80,000 people on the streets in Toronto. 80,000 people. You know, we can't get 2,000 people out to protest Rob Ford. We got 80,000 people out in the streets to oppose the war in Iraq. There were 250,000 people in Montreal. And I just went out and joined with others in opposing the war. But it was more than marching. Here's what happened for me. Here at NT, we started doing stuff in the school. We started an anti-war student club here at North Toronto. We hosted a forum, 2 of them in fact, where we brought students together. We did it at lunch. We offered free pizza. I remember there were 2 friends of mine, Jamie Jarvis and Ben Dickerson, and they said they'd play music, we'd give kids free pizza, and then we had students talking to other students, like we're doing now, about the war. I gave a talk about the reasons for war. Was it about oil? Was it about power? Was it about weapons of mass destruction? My friend Vishna Jovanovic, who was at school here, who was Serbian, talked about her experience with war. Liam Churchill, another pal of mine from school, he talked about multilateralism. He's a lawyer now. So he talked about multilateralism and how we need a united global international body. We had students talking to each other on political issues in high school. This was what I loved. So you have students in OAC, it was grade 13 before it was gone for me, talking back and forth about an issue like war, and you had a teacher put up his hand and say, if it's okay, Joe, I'd like to come down and give a 5-minute presentation on why I think there should be a war. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what, for me, it grounded in me at an early age that we as students had more to do than just be sideline sitters, that we could be in the field of action, that if we cared about issues, we could get involved. And when war was started, and I won't forget this because the principal at the time really chewed me out for it. The war was started on March the 20th, and I was upset. I had invested a lot into this. I was young, and I thought we could stop this war. So I wrote an announcement and gave it to my friend who read the morning announcements. Do we still have students read them? Yeah. So I'm sitting in homeroom. I'm in OAC, and it's March 20th, and the announcements start, and my announcement starts being read, and it says, right now, as we're sitting in our classrooms on a peaceful day, bombs are being dropped on Iraqi civilians in the war in Iraq, and then the announcement stopped. There was a call to the office, to our homeroom, saying, could Joe Cressi come down to the office? And the principal was like, Joe, what are you doing, man? He's like, you're hosting forums, it's all great, but there's a line. And there was a line, I crossed it. But here's what I learned, is that that war did go ahead, but Canada didn't get involved. And it's not just that we often need people inside positions of power, in the boardrooms, in the halls of Parliament making decisions. We also need people outside. People pushing, people pulling, people telling those in positions of power that when they're doing something wrong, we're there to stop them. And that happened. We look back and we're celebrating the fact that Canada didn't join that war, that the US did, and it was a mistake. But Canada didn't join because for a year in advance, people, students who were at North Toronto and thousands, hundreds of thousands of others said no. And so that was my early beginnings into how we, as individuals, as students, as kids, that we have a role to play. And I learned it starting here at North Toronto.
If you haven't learned a little bit about Joe in those stories, I describe him as the guy that I want on my team if there's a zombie apocalypse. Because not only was he an athletic star, he's great at sports, he's competitive, he's energetic, but he's got a heart, right? And he puts his energy out there to help others. And that's really fantastic. And that's the kind of person I'd like to have on my zombie apocalypse team. So my beginnings in politics and in social movements were similar. But it was a different it was a different event in my lifetime, in my childhood, that then went into my adolescence, my time here at North Toronto. And that event was the Montreal Massacre. And if you don't know about it, if it's not taught in school, it should be. It was a day in 1989 where a young man, not too much older than you guys, walked into a university classroom at L'École Polytechnique in Montreal, separated the men from the women, and then shot all the women. And then shot and killed all those women in the classroom, then went out in the hallway and shot some more. And 14 people were killed. And that really hurt this country. I think a lot of us felt that. Not only did women feel it because they felt threatened, but men felt it. And I was 11 years old, but I felt it. And I thought, you know what, something's got to be done. We've gone too far down this pathway of men and women, of violence against women, and something needs to be done. And there was actually a lot of men out there, older men, that were in front of this. One of them was my father, and working with a group of people, came up with the White Ribbon Campaign, which was men's action to end men's violence against women. And I think it's something that actually still exists here at the school today, and I'm so proud and pleased that continues. It started in Canada, and it's spread out for over the last 20 years to dozens of countries around the world. And they've got programs in India, they've got programs in countries in Africa, all over the US and South America, and it started a movement. And so my relation to that movement was when I was about 13 or 14. I started saying, hey, well, you know what? We've got to start catching men at a younger age and start getting them and calling them out and saying, you know what, violence is wrong. The pledge for the White Ribbon wasn't just that one doesn't or should not commit violence against women. It was men saying, we're not going to let others commit violence against women. We're not going to let our peers. We're not going to let our family. We're not going to let our friends. We're going to call it out when we see it. And we're going to take action. And so first, it ended up a very simple thing. I handed out white ribbons at the front of the school. And no one really knew what it was at that point. But the white ribbon was actually a symbol that the mothers of the women who were killed wore to commemorate their lost daughters. And so they wore the ribbon. That was brought to Toronto. And we were giving them out at the school a couple of years later. And at that point in time, I don't know how it goes these days, but a couple of kids got in a little trouble at a school dance, and so the school decided not to host any dances that year. And so I jumped on the occasion. I was sort of an entrepreneur at the same time, and I said, we're going to put on those dances, because we know we can do a good job. We know the kids will be respectful. They'll have a little fun, but they'll be respectful. So we put on those dances, and we gave the proceeds to the White Ribbon Campaign. But in addition to the money that was being brought in, we thought, what a great chance to catch young men and young women and talk to them about a very serious issue, an issue that they're going to face at some point or another, or they could face at some point or another in their life. And so we use that as the vehicle to actually capture folks' imaginations and start talking about the issue of violence and gender violence and violence against women not only at homes, but in schools. And so while it was pretty terrible that the school canceled the dances, they had pretty good reasons. I may or may not have been part of the cause of those reasons. But we turned it around and ended up making it a learning experience for other students. And I was so pleased. I went on the website and checked this NT Talk stuff out. And while I was on the website, I saw that it was still going on. And what a fantastic thing that we know that I'd say the next generation, are we part of this generation? Let's just call us that we're part of your generation. That we're continuing on that legacy of men learning to be more, that they can be more, of that the generation that's going to bring equality amongst people, both in the classrooms and in the homes and in the workplaces later on. And so I thought that was my big learning experience, where I turned around and said, you know what? It's about making a difference. It's about having an impact. It's about doing something and calling something out when it's wrong. In much the same way I think that Joe described the war, that we could be empowered in some way. Joe globally on that national scale with 80,000 people, and then us having those one-on-one conversations as I was handing out ribbons in the hallways in front of school. And so it was both of those things that I think really gave rise to what we would then do later on in our careers. I worked for Environmental Defence Canada, which is a national environmental charity, prior to going into politics. But I'm now a city councillor. I have been for 3.5 years. I'm going to try to get elected in 9 months from now. And a lot of that, a part of getting elected, actually had to do with this guy right over here. I'm going to say this young guy, but he is a little younger than me. When I was looking at the difference that I wanted to make in the world, this was 4 years ago in 2010, it was actually Joe that sat down with me and said, hey, I got a crazy idea, Mike. Why don't we run you in the next municipal election in your neighborhood? I represent Ward 19, Trinity Spadina, which, broadly speaking, is Bathurst Street to Dovercourt and Ossington, from Bloor Street to the water. I had never fathomed it, thought I would do this before. My dad was a politician, but I had never really thought that I was going to run. But it was a lot of the conversations with Joe that got me there. And so I'm going to pass it back to Joe to continue on how his rise to become one of our great political organizers.
Mike and I are going to compliment each other back and forth for the next hour. It's going to be great fun. You guys just watch. I'll say nice things about him. He'll say nice things about me. We'll feel great. You might be bored. It doesn't matter. I started out talking about the early years in NT and where it grounded me. So I want to now turn from the local to the international. And I want to talk about Africa. So today in my job, I'm a director and senior advisor with the Stephen Lewis Foundation. If you don't know what the foundation is, I'll give you a quick summary. What we do is we raise money in Canada and we fund grassroots women's projects in 15 African countries. Over the last 10 years since our foundation formed, we've distributed more than $74 million in small grants to local women's projects. And local women's projects that are dealing with the ravages of HIV and AIDS. Right now, there are 35 million people living in the world with HIV. 35 million. Of those 35 million, 24 million of them are in Africa. So there are 24 million people in Africa today living with HIV, and only 7 million of them are on treatment. Not for lack of want or for lack of drugs, but because they can't buy them, because they're not affordable. There's a lot of work to be done. So how did I get involved in that? Where did this start? Well, it did start when I was at North Toronto, but I won't talk about it. I was here for the OAC, so we had 5 years of high school, and I took grade 12 off. I disappeared, and I went to Johannesburg, South Africa for a year. I went and did a year abroad. I didn't get credit for it. I lived with a white British South African family, and then I lived with a Zulu family in Soweto, a township in South Africa. And it instilled in me an interest and a passion for the continent of Africa. And so when I was 23, I went to Ghana. Ghana in West Africa, and I spent a year there. And while I was studying in university, I worked with an organization called the Center for Popular Education and Human Rights. That's what it's officially called, the Center for Popular Education and Human Rights. What it's really called, not officially, not in any paper, is the Gay and Lesbian Center of Ghana. And it's not, we don't talk about that because, for this reason, In 53 of 54 African countries, homosexuality is illegal. And for the very reason that it is those of a particular sexual orientation are discriminated against, legalized discrimination, there's no education and awareness for those who are dealing with HIV. There's no prevention or education initiatives for young men who have sex with men or women. And so the rates of HIV and AIDS amongst those populations are exceptionally high. And so I spent a year there while studying as a peer support worker with this center. And what we did was we had peer support teams working with the gay and lesbian population to provide education, awareness, and counseling around HIV and AIDS. I'll tell you one story. So what did they do? What does that mean, these peer support teams? So every Friday we'd meet in Accra, Ghana, Accra, the capital where we were. Every Friday I'd meet with my peer support team, and we had these guys from across the city who did various things, including one of them was they would sell condoms at very cheap rates to other men, so that to practice safe sex. And so we were meeting this one Friday, and we'd go around the circle and said, how did you do this week? What did you learn? And this one guy said, well, this week I sold 17 condoms. I said, well, that's a lot. Well, what did you do differently this week? We're just starting this project. He said, well, I offered to demonstrate how to use the condoms with the guy after I sold them. And I sold tons of them. We sort of paused for a second. We said, okay, good initiative. We like the way you're thinking, but perhaps we don't want to pay you as a staff member to go and have sex with other men. But the truth was, and that did happen, but this organization, I have to tell you, the executive director was a man named Matt Darling. I won't say his last name because he's not public with his last name because it's dangerous. He is an openly gay man living in a country where homosexuality is illegal, working for an organization that seeks to bring greater equality and sensitivity to treatment. And it was tough. I remember him calling me one day and he said, Joe, last night 4 of our staff got beat up. They found our office. What do we do? We've already moved offices 3 times this year. What do we do? The stigma and the violence was such that these people, in the face of challenges the likes of which we can't comprehend, fought for their rights. So I did that, and I spent a year there. And then I went back, I came back to Canada, finished my university, worked here for a little while, and then I went back and I worked in South Africa. I went back there with my partner, now my wife, and I was working with an organization called the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. We were based in Johannesburg, and our mission was to work at an international level to change the policies around debt, around aid, and around increased trade and development from the West in support for African countries. And so I worked with this organization based in Johannesburg for another year, and I tell you, my experiences from Johannesburg to Ghana, it taught me a few things that I hold near and dear when we think about international issues. It's that for us here in Canada, especially those of us who are lucky enough to go to a school like NT, to have a home over our head, to live with lots of means and opportunity, that when we think of supporting those in the developing world, whether it's in Africa or other countries, it's not about charity. It's about social justice. That these people, by virtue of circumstance and where they're born, and if it's into a hard place, these are not people who are looking for a handout or help. These are people who deserve and demand equality, and it's up to us not to feel pity for them, not to hand out charity, but rather to see them as equals, as empowered people who deserve our support, not our pity or charity. And I think that's important when we think about international issues. That in a way it sounds corny, but we are all one as people. We just need to do a little bit better in terms of how we treat each other and how we support each other. And so that took me on a path to what we'll talk about in a second, which is politics. And I'll turn it back to the council.
By virtue of growing up in a political family, you get involved in stuff at an early age. So when I was, there you go. So when I was about 5 or 6 years old, they used to burn Toronto's garbage. You know, now we put it in blue bins and gray bins, or it's all blue bin and a green bin. They used to just burn all the garbage, and it was really bad for the environment. It was even worse for public health, for the health of mostly little kids and seniors, but for everybody's health. And so when I was a little kid, my dad used to drag me along to these protests, but we would stand on a green box and demand that the government shut down that incinerator and start recycling. And we won that at about 6 or 7 years old. At about 9 or 10, I was forcibly removed from the Eaton Center for handing out literature in support of striking Eaton's workers. So the Eaton's workers were getting paid very well, and we went as a family, because this is what you do with families on weekends in a political household, and we went and handed out literature at Eaton Center. So you can imagine as a teenager getting a lifetime ban at the Eaton Center wasn't very much fun, although it was rarely enforced. But that's what I was doing then. But my real passion for environmental issues came much later. I, again, like Joe, grew up in downtown Toronto. My family didn't have a cottage, so we went on camping trips. So we spent a lot of time up in the bush, and we'd paddle rivers, and we'd bike around with tents and food on our bikes, and we'd spend a lot of time in nature. When I got a little bit older, my parents sent me to a nature science camp here in Ontario. And I went there to then become a counselor there. But those values that I learned at this, it was a nature science camp, it wasn't really a sports-focused camp with fun water skiing, wakeboarding, and stuff like that. It was very much a camp about conservation and ecology, learning about bugs and birds and all that kind of stuff. And those were the values that really stuck with me going through. And they even transferred over to school. It was actually a chemistry teacher here at North Toronto that brought me from being a mediocre student to an A student. And I treasure her intervention almost when I was in grade 11 to say, Mike, you can do way better than this. And threw a test back at me, and I said, I can do way better than that. And I ended up starting to get good grades in school in chemistry, and then it transferred over into other courses. So much so, I decided to take biochem at the University of Toronto, thinking I wanted to go and study the next generation of plants and animals and how they interact and how they serve serve us as a society. But then what happened was it turns out I wasn't very good at chemistry. While I got good grades in high school, I really tanked at the university level. So then I took a course in political science as a lark, thinking I've been doing this since I was younger, this should be a great, easy course for me. And it turned out I did do pretty well, and I started getting good grades, again, for a change. But it wasn't just that I was getting it naturally, I was really loving it. I was loving figuring out how the system of government worked and how we can impact that system of government. And so then I took my passion for environmental issues and coupled that with this interest and ability in discussing government and social change and issues. And I started taking a degree in environmental management. Now that turned into a master's degree in urban planning, which I took at York University, just down the road. And shortly after my time at York University, I had a decision to make. And I was fortunate enough that I was offered a job in my field. I could go work for a consultant in Markham, reputable company, good job. My job there would have been siting nuclear waste dumps or helping them site nuclear waste dumps in Caribbean countries. So perhaps not in line with the values I had learned as an environmentalist. Or I could take a job that paid half as much for an environmental charity that was never going to have any money or much room to grow into. They give you better and better titles as you move up, not more money. But I would be able to bike to work, and I'd be working in downtown Toronto. And I weighed the pros and cons. I actually went to my dad for some advice, and said, I don't know what to do. I've probably got more of a career at this consulting firm, but really my passion's here in the environmental movement. What should I do? And he said, you know what you got to do is go where you think you can have the biggest impact in what you feel most passionate about. And so I made that decision. I went and worked for a national environmental charity, again, environmental defense. I was put in charge of, or not in charge, I started on the bottom of the ladder, worked my way up, but working with policy related to renewable sources of renewable energy, so wind turbines, solar panels, all that fun stuff, and protecting water in the Great Lakes. So I got to travel around the Great Lakes and talk to different organizations that were working. We brought forward proposals to government that they should adopt We helped put pressure on government through organizing protests or petitions, or just by trying to convince them that it was better for the people of Toronto. We coordinated an effort. And we had a lot of success in that. And so we got laws changed. We got a Clean Water Act put in place in the province of Ontario that protects sources of drinking water for everyone, that says you can't do certain things in a certain proximity to a well or to where Toronto gets their water out in the Great Lakes. And then we helped put out the Green Energy Act. I was named one of the top 20 green energy movers and shakers of 2010 or something like that.
There were only 20.
There were only 20, and I probably got 20. 20th. So, but we got a law passed that's actually now seeing the largest growth in wind turbine construction that Ontario has ever seen, and it's made Ontario a contender in that. You see more wind turbines up now in Southern Ontario as a result of the activism we did as an organization and the work we did with governments. So it's not necessarily about just waving the flag. Waving the flag and protesting is a critical part of it, but it's not just about that. And so it was my education in urban planning, and my education in government systems, that gave me the expertise to go and take an idea and take something I was passionate about and translate it to policy and change. And so with those pieces of legislation change, that's when my world changed slightly because of the opportunity that took me into politics, which I'll leave for the very last segment.
This is where we want to chat very briefly a little bit about politics. So today, I'm active in the NDP, and as it stands right now, we have the NDP has something called a federal executive. It's the board of directors, and there's an elected representative from each province, and I serve on that as the Ontario rep. I manage campaigns on the side, so I do my day job dealing with Africa, and then in my evenings, and when campaigns come around, I often will take a leave for 6 weeks to run a campaign. I chaired Mike Layton's campaign, I chaired his stepmom Olivia Chow's campaign, I've run a number of losing campaigns. And occasionally, you know, they have those silly talking heads on television where you have a person from every of the parties and they yell at each other and scream at each other, and I do that on a weekly basis too. Though I'm one of the few you'll see who smiles a lot. I don't make a lot of sense, but I smile always. But here's why I think politics is important, and here I suppose to start it with is here's how I got involved, if you're interested. So I talked about, back in 2002, protesting. I cared about issues. Politics, political parties, that all seemed so removed, it didn't seem as important to me. Well, back in 2002, 2003, while I was protesting the Water Act, I met a guy named Jack Layton. I met Mike's dad. He was running for leadership of the NDP at the time, and he said, "Joe, come join me. Come get involved. See what this is about. See how change doesn't just happen on the outside, when you're out in the streets or where you're advocating for change. It can also happen in the inside." So I started out. I went to university at Carleton, and I became the president of the Carleton University NDP. I got involved in my local riding association. You know, we have 308 ridings across the country, and every party has a local riding association. So I became the president of my local riding association. I started volunteering on campaigns. I've now started managing campaigns. But it all started out, for me, because I cared about the issues. And this is where I think today politics is a problem. And for our generation, and listen, I mean, you know, I'm a decade older. We are the same generation. For our generation, you know, the things that I care about, and perhaps some of them you care about as well, but they're issues. You know, I care about climate change. I'm worried about it. I care that there's a growing gap between rich and poor in our country. I care about it. I worry that cities like Toronto, that we have crumbling infrastructure, that our transit is out of date, that we're not looking towards the future and building 21st century cities. I care about that. I care about the issues, and it seems to me that too often right now in politics, they don't talk about the issues. It's become about power, and it's become a blood sport. You know, in the old days, people would disagree in politics. Politicians would stand up and disagree, and then they'd go out for a beer together or a glass of wine. These days, it's acrimonious, it's divisive, and it seems that we never talk about what's important, which is the issues. And that's why I think for our generation, so many of us think it's a waste of time, or why would you get involved? Because they're not dealing with what's important. They're not dealing with the issues that are going to affect our lives. Climate change is going to affect us. Our children, our grandchildren, are going to have to deal with climate change because today's leaders aren't dealing with it. Because they're too focused on arguing over the Senate or arguing over other petty, they're not even issues, squabbles. And so for me, I think politics matters because it should be about issues, and if we believe so, we can make change and we can get involved. And so I'd like to see, in terms of politics, I think we need to focus on issues, and I think we need to focus on the tone of politics. That, you know, I think politics at its core should be about service. That at its core, you know, when you rank politicians, like, what do we say? That there's that poll, it's, who do you trust most? Politicians, lawyers, teachers, nurses, others. Politicians are way down at the bottom. Teachers, thankfully, are still up high. We can feel good about that. But politicians are way down at the bottom. Politics, to me, is about serving your community. That should be a noble profession. And so I think we need more politicians, more people willing to stand forward, as Mike has done, who are stepping forward for the right reasons. Not to get power, not to become a professional politician, but because they care about issues. Because they want to make change in their community. And so for me, my big motivation going forward, my plea for you, to you, is that if you're interested in the issues, don't lose sight of politics. Because if politics isn't working, go fix it. We can fix it. And if you think you can't get elected, you can. Mike got elected at age 31. As he said, you know, it was 10 or 12 months before election, a couple of us sat around the table and said, maybe you should run. We started having planning meetings. None of us knew anything about it. Well, some of us knew. We had the benefit of a family connection and Mike, who'd been involved. But we had a bunch of, it was environmentalists and peace activists, and we got around the table and we started organizing. And the political, you know, folks in the background would say, what the hell are you doing? You should be out canvassing or checking marks, and we wanted to have these Bike with Mike festivals. But if you get engaged, you can create change. And I'll just put a quick plug out there. If you want to see Rob Ford gone, as I desperately do, you can get rid of him. It's possible. And I'm hoping Mike's going to help.
So yes, I am a city councillor. I work at City Hall with Mayor Rob Ford, but I got to tell you, it's not all it's cracked up to be. That doesn't get laughs everywhere. It doesn't get laughs everywhere. Listen, I just really love this shot, actually. That's in the back of my campaign room, and it reminds me of like a House of Cards episode or something. You have one person on a BlackBerry, others checking marks here, signs in the background, and that's frankly what it's like on one day of the year, or one day every 4 years. It's that exciting. Otherwise, it's a lot of meetings and listening. It's a lot of listening to folks. So one of the big things that has affected me in more recent years is the passing of my father, and that goes without saying. But in particular, it was that outcry and the support and the messages that people just started sending my family, the love that came out to us. And a lot of that love had to do with a lifetime of, like Joe mentioned, of just good service. A lifetime of service to the community. Even more came from one-on-one meetings that he had, issues that he had worked on through the years that he had been involved. And it taught me one really important thing. And we get a lot of angry phone calls in our office. It's not unlike other councillors' offices. I probably get less angry phone calls than others, maybe. I certainly hope so. But the idea that this is actually a selfless profession. Or a thankless profession, sorry. I think that you serve your community and there's nothing that comes back or is given back. And I think that the emotional outpouring of support that was sent to my family following his death is proof that that's not true. That despite the fact that you can disagree with someone about one issue and then completely agree with them on the other, as long as you don't make it an adversarial thing, that means you can never agree with someone again. If you draw your line in the sand and said, well, I hate you because of your position on that, then you can't build those bridges. And what I think was done remarkably well, and where politicians and in other aspects of your life, you have the ability to have an impact on others in the type of way that you get this kind of support after you pass, is through building those bridges. And the first step of that is being able to listen and not be confrontational and adversarial with people. And then you can build on that. So Part of this, though, and it's something that meant a lot to me, was the letter that my dad left. I had no knowledge of it prior to that, and the first time I had heard it was actually it being read from the announcement the morning that he died. And there was a very distinct message for everyone, which was we have to build a world that's more hopeful, that brings optimism to more people, that is about loving one another instead of hating one another, and that's that idea of making politics not an adversarial thing. But then there was the message to youth, and I think that resonated with me, even though I'm not a youth by many stretches of the imagination. Don't let the hair fool you. I am the youngest city councillor, and I'm not that old. Just my hair seems to think that I am. But the message that if we're going to get somewhere, if we're going to start solving the problems that we see all around us, the homelessness on the streets, climate change that we know is around the corner, which is why we're getting such severe storms. If we're going to be able to take action on that, the growing inequality in our society, and in particular around the world, the conflicts that are going on around the world, we're going to do that by working together. And we're going to do that by getting young people engaged on issues. And we're going to do that by making sure young people feel empowered, like they can make a difference. And that's where I think Joe's story about us, a couple of young folks sitting around a table chatting about issues that then led to how one makes political change through elections, was part of that empowering piece in my life, saying that, you know what, we can actually have an impact out there. And my dad used to have a great line that was, don't let them tell you it can't be done, which is huge. So when people try to say, you know what, that's too far out of reach, sure, it might be difficult. You might only get partway there, but there's no reason why you can't think that you should use that as your goal in everything you do, from when it's exams that will come up at the end of the year to your next challenge at university or at college or in a trade, or just going out in the working world and trying to make a go. Don't let them tell you that you can't actually accomplish it, because then you're going to be just resigned to the fact that you're not going to be able to. And those massive challenges, those challenges of global warming, of global inequality, of peak oil, of all of those massive challenges will never be overcome unless individually we all think, you know what, we can do that. Because then what happens when individuals think they can do that, they get together with other individuals that think they get that. And then that group then is able to attract more people. And it's not all about, again, waving flags in the street and shouting protest songs. The movement can happen in any number of different ways. And I think that we've given some examples of that. And I think that what is shown up there is that people will appreciate it, will appreciate the hard work that's done. And certainly as someone a little bit older than you guys, I hope you guys are up to the challenge, because there's a lot of work that we actually need to accomplish. And I hope that we were able to give a little bit of insight to how one can go about solving some of those larger problems.